It's okay to want an abortion. Did you know 1 in 4 people who can get pregnant will have one? So it's actually more common than most people think. At CareFM, you can choose what type of abortion care works best for you. We have in-person locations with private entrances in Atlanta, Chicago, and the Washington, D.C. areas. And we also offer medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. For some people, it's more comforting to come into a private office where they can sit with one of our medical providers and either leave no longer pregnant or with abortion pills in hand. For others, they prefer to get abortion pills through the mail so they can decide the best time and place to complete the process. Getting abortion pills by mail from CareFM is simple. Fill out an online form, and a licensed provider will review your medical history. And if eligible, your medication will be shipped to you in a couple of days. Kara, our text-based abortion companion, will guide you through the process from start to finish with instructions, reminders, and answers to all your questions whenever they come up 24/7. With either choice, please know CareFM will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carefm.org.
In Walmart's Who Newville, joy started to grow. For online-only savings sure to steal the show. Tech treats and toys so dazzling and new. Walmart Cyber Monday deal soon ready for you. It's online only with very little time to spare. December 1st will soon be here, so be sure to be there. The Who's are prepared. Are you ready too? A day packed with savings. Amazing! Who knew? Subject to availability, terms and fees apply.
Get your mother-loving ears on because your big-time radio DJ's got news. PayPal lets you choose how you want to pay for all the stuff. With PayPal, I can pay in-store, pay online, or pay over time. What's that? You want this translated into song? I hope you're sitting down. You can pay your own way. You keep those ears on, you hear? Don't just pay, baby. PayPal.
Learn more at paypal.com.
Ukraine has got to be defended. As I keep saying, they don't have to win the war, they have to not lose it.
Hello, a quick bonus episode and a discussion on Ukraine with Gordon Corrigan for you, as I was keen to get his thoughts in light of his successful Substack writing, and to follow on from Saturday's episode. Gordon is an acclaimed historian and the author of The Second World War and Military History. Links are in the show notes. Coming up on Saturday, it's part 1 of the Vietnam War special with Jeffrey Waro. Please do share with family and friends, and if you can follow or subscribe, you'll get an update when our episodes drop. But in the meantime, it's me talking Ukraine with Gordon Corrigan. Gordon, welcome back to the podcast. A great pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much for joining.
Not at all. It's very good to be back again.
Yes, indeed. And I wanted to get you on because, and for listeners, they will have had an episode on Saturday, and now I'm speaking to Gordon on Tuesday with the intention of getting this out for the next day, because we're talking about Ukraine. Everything moves so quickly. As far as I know now, America has abandoned its allies, and that's not changed for now. The economy's tanking. Are we headed to World War III? I don't know. But Gordon, the reason why I wanted to speak to you is because I was reading your Substack, and for listeners, the links are in the show notes, which was really interesting, really good. And I've been enjoying receiving these into my inbox every Sunday. And they range from history, and the more recent ones are on the Trump shenanigans. But Gordon, I know you were just about to explain a few things to me before we started recording. So why don't we just kick off with what you were going to
Well, I
say.
was going to say that a lot of people aren't aware of the history of Ukraine. Where does Ukraine come from? I mean, originally it was part of Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire in the 1200s. When the Mongol Empire fell apart, it was part of Lithuania, the area that we know now as Ukraine. Well, then, when the Grand Duke of Lithuania and the King of Poland were one and the same person in 1569, I think it was, then Ukraine became part of what was officially the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but actually it was the Polish Empire, and it was always referred to as the Polish Empire. And the Polish Empire, of course, surrounded by Russia, Prussia, Austria, and the great European powers, constantly fighting. And in one occasion, in the late 17th century, the 1660s, in one of their scuffles with Russia, the Polish Empire did cede part of what is now Ukraine to the east of the Dnieper River, to Russia. And Russia, of course, did what Russia always does when Russia was expansionist, right on from the 16th century onwards. And as soon as they acquire a new bit of land, they immediately settled it with Russians, very sensibly. And that, of course, now eventually the Polish Empire got that bit back, but it had Russian-speaking, or ethnic Russians, settlers in it. And that's the area of Luhansk and Donetsk today. And of course, the separatism that started in 2014 was started by those Russian ethnicity living over on the other side of the Dnieper. Now, because they're originally of Russian ethnicity and they speak Russian, doesn't mean they want to be Russians, although undoubtedly some of them do. Well, the Polish Empire was a major player for a long time, and eventually the great powers got fed up with constantly fighting with them, and they divided the Polish Empire between them, between Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and that was in 1793. And the bit of the Polish Empire that we now know as Ukraine went to Russia. That was during the reign of Catherine the Great. And for 150 years, there was no Poland. I mean, Poland just disappeared, wasn't on the map. And the great credit to them all is that they managed to retain their language, their culture, and their religion for all that period. And when Poland was reconstituted again after the First World War, 1918, they reconstituted the original territory of Poland. They didn't reconstitute the Polish Empire. So the Ukraine, as we now know it, stayed in Russia. You then get the Russian Civil War, 1917 on to 1922, when there was really a separate civil war in Ukraine, because the Ukrainians were never very happy being Russian. And there was a separate little civil war. And for about 3 weeks, there was an independent Republic of Ukraine. It didn't last very long. The Ukrainian monarchists, constitutionalists, etc., the white Ukrainians were defeated by the Bolshevik Ukrainians. 1922, Wrangel's White Russian army was massacred in what we now know as Ukraine. Ukraine becomes a Soviet Socialist Republic, part of the USSR. Second World War, in come the Germans. They're greeted as liberators. There's a lot of collaboration between the Ukrainians and the Germans because they didn't like being the Russians. At the end of the Second World War, there's a certain amount of naughty, what the Soviets regard as naughty Ukrainians are dealt with. Ukraine carries on being a part of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union collapses in 1991, and all the constituent republics were able to hold a referendum. Did they want to stay with the Russian Federation or did they want to be independent? Ukraine voted to be independent. Now, there is then the question of the Crimea. The Crimea was originally taken from the Ottoman Turks by Catherine the Great in 1783. It had been a khanate of the Ottoman Empire before that. And it was annexed as part of Russia. Now, if you look at the map, in 1953 or 4, I can't remember the exact date, but Khrushchev moved the Crimea from being part of Russia to being part of Ukraine, the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine. Now, that was for administrative reasons. And of course, it makes sense looking at where Crimea is in the Black Sea. But it didn't matter because Ukraine was part of the USSR. Well, then come 1991, Ukraine votes to be independent. Crimea, most of the Crimea, although the referendum was sort of 52% pro-Ukraine and 48% or whatever wanting to stay with Russia, the occupants of the Crimea started an independent Republic of the Crimea. It only lasted a few weeks because the Ukrainians stamped on it. But one could argue, indeed I would argue, that the Crimea really is Russian. And indeed, in 1991, they could have negotiated it back into Russia, but the whole thing happened so quickly.
Even if a majority, albeit a depressingly familiar 52 to 48, I think you mentioned, even if a majority were in favor of Ukraine, I mean, that's quite a lot of Ukrainians who are now being made to be part of Russia.
It's interesting because I used to go to Ukraine a lot, go to Crimea a lot before it was annexed by Russia in 2014. And I used to say to people, "What are you?" And they would nearly all say, "I'm Russian." All the signs were in Russian. The language is Russian. Some would say, "I'm Ukrainian and Russian." The Black Sea Fleet, of course, an agreement between Russia and Ukraine that the Black Sea Fleet could be stationed there. So again, the occupants of the Crimea collaborated with the Germans, and after the Second World War, Stalin sent all the Crimean Tatars, who were the descendants of the original Ottoman inhabitants. They were all sent off to Siberia. Well, then under Gorbachev, they started to come back, and then they suddenly found themselves part of Russia again. So, I mean, I think we could argue about Crimea. My personal view is it's probably Russian role in Ukraine. But that's really a separate issue. I mean, the point is that what happened after, I mean, immediately on independence, the first president of Ukraine, of course, was an old communist. That's what happened in all the republics. The people who had been running it as secretary generals of the Communist Party just became secretary general of the Democracy Party, People's Party, whatever they wanted to call it, and carried on. But then you got a chap called Yanukovych. Now, Yanukovych was pro-Russian. He was prime minister, president, kicked out, back again, in, out, in, out. And eventually he was driven out by something called the Orange Revolution. And the problem from the Russian point of view was instead of having somebody who was basically pro-Russian, you've now got someone who actually is looking west rather than east. He and his female deputy. So they're sort of looking east. Now that upset the Russians. Ex-Soviet republics were given gas at a discount, whereas the rest of Europe paid the full rate. What the Russians did was they simply said, right, no more discount. You pay the same as Germany and anybody else who's getting gas from us. But that was really the sort of start of this problem between Russia and Ukraine. And then in 2014, when you got the separatists movement in Luhansk and Donetsk, supported by the Russians, although they said they weren't there, but they were so-called volunteers. They were members of the Russian army, but they'd taken their Russian badges off.
One thing that did occur, you've talked about the separatists, 2014. In 1991, when there were those votes, those referendums for the Ukrainians, in that region, unlike the Crimea, there was a lot more pro-Ukrainian, I think it was around 65, maybe even 70% to join or to, create the country of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Which actually surprised me when I learned about that, because the whole reason for the Russians going in is that they claim it's Russian.
Yeah, well, of course, they go way back. They talk about Vladimir, the Grand Prince of Kiev, who was the man who brought Christianity into what we now know as Russia. And that was in 880 something. So they look back to that. And they say, well, no, of course, Ukraine was always Russian. No, it wasn't. There were all sorts of Slavonic tribes all over the place, and the Grand Prince Vladimir was only one of them. But because he was converted to Christianity in the Crimea, that is, again, one of the reasons why the Russians claim Crimea. They say this is a sacred, this is where we all started, which is a whole lot of old bollocks, if I'm allowed to say that.
You certainly are, Gordon.
On a podcast. But that's one of the things that they claim, that Ukraine was always Russian. I mean, it wasn't. Yes, they're Slavs, they're Slavonic. Their language is Slavonic, but they've never really been happy as Russians. They never really considered themselves as Russians. And of course, eventually in April 2019, well, there have been all sorts of problems, as there were in all the ex-Soviet republics, problems of corruption and whatnot. And then in April 2019, Zelensky, who's not a professional politician, gets in on an anti-corruption manifesto. And he gets in with, I can't remember what the votes were, but it was the first time since independence that one party had got an overall majority in parliament. Previous parties have been in coalition. For the first time, Zelensky's party has an overall majority. And they do start to sort things out. And I used to go to Ukraine before Zelensky and after Zelensky, and there's no question that things were much better under Zelensky. Things were happening. And when I talked to the locals, they say, yeah, at last, we don't have to pay money to policemen. We don't have to, bribe our way past the customs or anything like that. So, he was really doing terribly well. And he and his party and most of his people were looking west rather than east. They have ambitions to join the EU, which they probably eventually will be able to. They have ambitions to join NATO. That won't happen. And the reason that cannot happen is nothing to do with America, but you can only join NATO if all NATO members agree. Now, you remember that when Sweden wanted to join, there was a great pause because Turkey was prepared to vote against, and eventually Turkey was brought on side, and Sweden is now a member. But Hungary, which is under Orban anyway, which is very much a Russian poodle at the moment. How long that will last, I don't know, because been to Hungary quite a few times, know Hungarians, and they're not actually terribly pro-Russian. But at the moment, anyway, Hungary would vote against. So they're not going to get into NATO.
Well, I think the Americans would vote against as well, wouldn't they?
Well, the Americans, of course, would vote against. Yeah, absolutely. So my view is that if we cannot, and I'm afraid, as long as Trump is in the White House, I don't think we can, I'm afraid we cannot rely on the so-called special relationship. I mean, forget that. And I'm not sure that we can rely on Article 5 either. Now, some people have said to me, well, hang on. Trump's
and just for the benefit of listeners, Article 5 is an attack on one member state is an attack on all.
Yes, it's part of the NATO treaty. It's only actually been implemented once, and that was after the Twin Towers in America, when the Americans said, right, Article 5. And we all wrote in
about that, actually.
Yeah, we all wrote in. We sent troops to Afghanistan and all the rest of it. That's the only time it's ever actually been implemented. So if that can't be relied on, and Trump has made it fairly clear that it can't, okay, he's only going to be there for 4 years. But his successor almost certainly will be Vance, who's just as nasty and probably not as clever. And Vance could do 2 tours. So we're looking at possibly 12 years before we can start talking to the Americans again. So if we cannot rely on the United States, my own view is that we, the British, should try and create a sort of NATO light, if you like. In other words, a European defensive pact. And most of the Europeans still look to us as the military, apart from America, as the military leader. Now, we are no state to fight a war at the moment. But if we really get a grip and get things sorted out, then I think that we could produce a European defence pact. It's got to be strong enough and big enough to deter Russia and, if necessary, defeat them. Now, that
requires a lot of defence spending.
An awful lot of defence spending.
What I mean by that is our current government have promised to get to, I think, 3% by the middle of the next parliament.
Yeah,
it's going to need a lot more than that.
I think we need to be looking at 5.
Yeah.
Realistically. And some of the leaks coming out of the Defence Review, which of course the Defence Review was set up before, got quite as serious as it is.
Yeah, when the new Labour government came in, they under Robertson, the former NATO.
The latest leak I had, which is probably true, is that they're saying it's 10 years before we can fight a war. Well, I think we can reduce that considerably if we tell the factories, look, come on, increase your stocks. We want, more this and that. We've got the best tank in the world, Challenger 2. Unfortunately, we've only got 3 armoured regiments in the whole of the army, which is nothing like enough. How quickly can we produce Challenger 3? Probably not very quickly. Okay, let's buy Leopard from Rheinmetall or whatever. The nuclear umbrella, can we redesign the missile compartment on the new dreadnoughts to fire French missiles with the British warheads? Now, the French missile is entirely independent of America, whereas we buy Tridents from America.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. Yes, we're utterly reliant on America for our nuclear.
We're reliant on the fact that we buy Trident missiles, and every 8 years, I think it's about 8 years, those missiles are changed over because they're past their sell-by date or whatever. So we are reliant on the Americans. Now, Charles de Gaulle, who didn't like us at all. I mean, he said that throughout his presidency, he was never to be taken nearer than 40 kilometers from Agincourt. But he insisted when the force de frappe, as they originally called it, I think it's now called the force de dissuasion, was to be completely independent. So what possibly we could do, and it would probably mean redesigning the missile compartment on the dreadnoughts, was we could take French missiles and put British warheads on them. At the moment, we buy the missile from America, but the warheads are our own, and of course the boats are our own. And once we've got the missiles, as far as I'm aware, the Americans can't stop us firing them. But
this appeals to me, Gordon, because I can't help liking de Gaulle despite his hatred of us.
Yes.
But also, this reunites Britain and France, just like the Crimean War, which I'd like to remind any Russian listeners, the Allies actually won.
Yep.
But, this is returning to sort of mid-19th century alliances.
Well, it would make complete sense. I mean, the three major powers in Europe, and all right, we're not technically part of Europe, are Britain, France,
geographically
and Germany.
We are, Gordon.
Well, geographically we are, yes. But I voted for Brexit, I'll remind you, for reasons of sovereignty, not for anything else. But we
have all comers here, Gordon.
It makes sense for those three powers to be in cahoots. Now, the problem with the obvious military leader in Europe is Germany. From the Great Elector to 1945, they were the best soldiers in Europe, but they have thrown away their military dignity a long time ago. And although the present Chancellor designate has said they've got to spend a lot more, the debt brake is going to be taken away, so perhaps we are getting somewhere. But again, the poor old Bundeswehr has been so run down over the years. It's going to take a long time to get them up to the mark.
I think when you say Germany to become military leader in Europe, that does make me a little uncomfortable, given the past.
Well, let's remember that they always used to be on our side. It's only the War of the Spanish Succession, when there were Germans on both sides, and the two world wars that they were the enemy. The rest of the time they were always
yes, but those two world wars were quite significant.
Yeah, but I mean, we have a German monarchy. Our language is German. We've actually got an awful lot more in common with the Germans than we have with the French, really. But Germany is now a democracy, and I think will remain so. AfD, yeah, it's a spurt in the polls. They got 20%, I think, in the election. They're a bit of a worry because, surprisingly, for a right-wing party, they are actually a bit pro-Russian. So we don't really want them in the German government. But in the meantime, it's probably the British, the French, the Scandinavians. They'll row in, the Dutch, the Belgians, Italians, maybe, possibly the Spanish. But the two armies that have got the wherewithal to do something are the British and the French. And I think that between us, we could create a sort of NATO light, if, for want of a better expression, or a European defence pact. Not a European army, that would never work, but a European defence pact, which I think we could defend Ukraine. It won't be easy, and it will be very expensive. But I do believe we have to do it, because if Russia wins in Ukraine, or there's a temporary peace, that just gives the Russians time to build more tanks, sort out the army, realize the cock-ups they made and put them right before they come back again. And they'll come back again either to take the whole of Ukraine, or what they haven't got, or probably Moldova would be the next one, and then probably the Baltic states. I mean, they've never really accepted that the Baltic states is independent. They broke away from Russia during the First World War and remained independent, annexed again in 1940 as part of Russia. Finland, of course, became part of the Russian Empire after the Napoleonic Wars. And again, they've never really accepted that. And Putin, certainly, he's not trying to recreate the USSR, but I think he is possibly trying to recreate the old Tsarist empire. They'll certainly have a go at that. So we've got, Ukraine has got to be defended. as I keep saying, they don't have to win the war, they have to not lose it.
Yeah.
Because if they do, let's not kid ourselves. In the worst case, from the British point of view, in the worst case, it's either a humiliating climb down, forget any influence we ever had, or a defeat, a military defeat, and Russians having victory parades down Whitehall. And I know that sounds frightfully exaggeration, but we've really, I think now, fortunately, I think people are realizing that we have got to step up. We have got to produce armed forces that are capable of fighting a conventional war. That all the hollowing out and all the nonsense about the peace dividend and everything else, that's gone. We've got to really sort things out with Europe. I don't think we can rely, I'm afraid, on America. It might be another 12 years before we can really talk to somebody sensible in America again. I hope I'm wrong.
But I think you're right, because in 12 years' time, let's assume there's all of a sudden some kind of Atlanticist president. 12 years would have passed when, defense thinking would have changed. So, the goalposts would have changed. Looking at our defense spending, at the moment we're arguing about 0.2% here, being taken from other departments. But that's not really going to cut it. As you said, it needs to get to 5%. I was looking at our defense GDP as a share of GDP. And since I think even sort of 88, 89 were around 2.2, 2.4. I mean, so we're going to have to spend money on defense that we haven't seen since the sort of 60s, where it was much higher.
It's okay to want an abortion. Did you know 1 in 4 people who can get pregnant will have one? So it's actually more common than most people think. At Care FM, you can choose what type of abortion care works best for you. We have in-person locations with private entrances in Atlanta, Chicago, and the Washington, D.C. areas. And we also offer medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. For some people, it's more comforting to come into a private office where they can sit with one of our medical providers and either leave no longer pregnant or with abortion pills in hand. For others, they prefer to get abortion pills through the mail so they can decide the best time and place to complete the process. Getting abortion pills by mail from Care FM is simple. Fill out an online form, and a licensed provider will review your medical history. And if eligible, your medication will be shipped to you in a couple of days. Kara, our text-based abortion companion, will guide you through the process from start to finish with instructions, reminders, and answers to all your questions whenever they come up 24/7. With either choice, please know Care FM will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carefm.org.
Yep. I mean, when I joined the army, it was 9%. And even at the end of the Cold War, we were still spending 4 and a bit. I know the government's terribly reluctant. All political parties are reluctant to raise income tax because they get into power by bribing an ignorant and greedy electorate who want instant gratification and are only interested in things that affect them directly. But 2% on income tax, I am quite prepared to spend 2% on income tax, on my income tax. That would raise something like 20 billion. So that would be a start. Sort out the welfare, sort that out. Get rid of a lot of the sort of woke nonsense. We can find the money, but we've got to say, look, okay, you've taken a bit from foreign aid, soft power, may or may not be a good thing. Depends what's being spent on, but you can't just do it by taking a little bit here, a little bit there. You've got to bite the bullet, and I'm afraid it's extra taxes. It has to be.
Right. Okay. So, Gordon, on your Substack, most recently, you were fielding a few of the questions. So I thought we could spend the sort of last 10 minutes here. Could you just sort of run through the sort of questions you get from your readers, which might be occurring to some of the listeners?
Well, I mean, quite a few. They're not all unbalanced. I mean, a lot of the
just before Gordon, aspects of history listeners, perhaps there's crossover, but they're very educated, enlightened, and sensible people.
Yeah, certainly they are. The comeback from Europe and the UK is largely supportive. Some of the comeback from America is supportive. Others are saying, well, hang on, you've been taking our money for years and years and years. Why should we be paying for your defense? They're absolutely right. And I've always said that on many forums for many years. So we agree there. They are, and I suspect this is possibly Breitbart, which is a news agency that's widely looked at in America. And they tend to take something, a kernel of truth, and then build a sort of conspiracy theory around it. Because I've been told that Zelensky is passionately corrupt, that he has a large mansion in somewhere in Florida, that he's got loads of money tucked away in dodgy banks in the Caribbean. That simply isn't true. If it was true, it would have been very quickly found out by our own agencies, and that's nonsense. They don't even, many of them, now whether they have watched the whole interview or not, I'm not sure. I don't think that anyone could say that Trump and Vance behaved properly to Zelensky.
It was an ambush, wasn't it?
It was appalling. It was absolutely appalling. I mean, bad manners were apart from anything else. And where Zelensky possibly, I would have advised him always have an interpreter.
Yes.
Because that gives you time to think.
And it's his third language.
If you're being interrogated or interviewed. He didn't get a chance to put his case at all. But quite a lot of my readers, well, not quite a lot, some of my American readers support what Trump and Vance said. I mean, they're supporting their own government, their own head of state. I was accused of being perfidious Albion. I'm not quite sure what they meant by that. I think
that's a compliment, Gordon.
Well, quite. Albion perfide was Napoleon. Another one accused me of trying to refight the Crimean War. I did point out that we actually won that war. One said we're going to have another Suez crisis. It's interesting the remark they made, or one of my correspondents said about the Suez crisis. America, of course, didn't back us in that. In fact, they actively sought to frustrate it. Foster Dulles, who was then the Secretary
of State,
effectively the Foreign Secretary, said that if he hadn't been away from his office because he was ill, he would have reversed the policy. And Eisenhower did say in his memoirs that one of the mistakes of his presidency was in not supporting the British over Suez. But that's water under the bridge now. I mean, we deployed, I think it was 6 aircraft carriers, Suez, 56. We now have 2. So the sad thing is that the so-called special relationship, which has really served us pretty well for a long time, a lot of Americans are pro-British. But the fact is that the Trump administration has got into office by a large majority. They won the popular vote, which is unusual in presidential elections. There are other questions too, diplomatically. The state visits. Now, there are going to be an awful lot of people demonstrating against Trump if he comes to England. I think it's bad manners with any head of state, but it's going to happen. If the police keep the demonstrators away from where they can be seen, well, then there'll be accusations of stamping on free speech and all the rest of it. And talking about free speech, of course, there seems to be a complete misunderstanding in America. I mean, Vance was very volatile about the question of free speech. Somebody's been jailed for praying. No, he wasn't. He was in a restricted area, and when he failed to move, when asked so several times by a policeman, he was arrested. That's what he was arrested for, not for praying. And as for Tommy Robinson, whose views, he's perfectly entitled to hold his views. I find them repellent, but he's entitled to have them. He's entitled to express them. He wasn't jailed for expressing his views. He was jailed for a number of cases, repeated acts of contempt of court. That's what he was jailed for. And for Musk to say, that Tommy Robinson is a political prisoner and whatever, is a load of nonsense.
Yes, it's completely ridiculous.
And they simply don't seem to understand the British judicial system, which is extraordinary because American law is based on British common law. And in fact, decisions by British courts can be quoted in America as precedent. So it's unusual that they've failed to understand that, or perhaps don't want to understand it.
Yeah, I think we're at that stage actually now, Gordon. But Gordon, this has been very interesting. I just wanted to leave you with one last question, actually.
Yeah.
I, particularly after the row in the office and the failure to sign the minerals deal, I was thinking that really Zelensky should step away now. He's a hero for what he did, but he clearly is hated by the US administration, who he's going to have to deal with. So will it help Ukraine more if they can replace him with someone who is more palatable to the Americans? still.
I think that the trouble is the Ukrainians are a proud people, and I think that I think they would see that as a climb down, as kowtowing, and I'm not sure they could possibly agree with that. I mean, part of the reason of Trump's dislike of Zelensky goes way back when Trump was trying to get Zelensky to dig up dirt on the Bidens. Biden's son was a director of a company in Ukraine, and Trump, if you remember, Trump was impeached actually for doing this.
Indeed, yeah.
Zelensky was not going to get involved in American domestic politics, and quite rightly said, no, I'm not having anything to do with it. And of course, Trump has never forgiven him. And Trump is a man, he takes passional affront at things. He takes passional revenge on people who don't go along with them, which is not the way to conduct foreign policy. I mean, you may not like somebody, but you very often have to do business with them. So I don't think that Zelensky standing down would be the answer. I think that either he's got to sign up to what the Americans want, and if the Americans don't give him security guarantees, then he's not going to sign. And I think he's right not to sign. And that's when we've got to step in.
Okay, Gordon, look, this has been fantastic. Really enjoyed getting your thoughts. And so we will have this out for tomorrow. So that's hopefully nothing will change in the geopolitical sense, so that all your pearls of wisdom will remain true as they are today. Thank you.
Well, I hope so.
Thanks so much for listening. You can get in touch via Spotify or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. Plenty more great history on the way, with the first of a 2-part special on the Vietnam War. But until then, thank you and good night.